Thank you very much. I should start by saying again what an honor and a privilege it's been to be here at Biola, and to add my personal thanks to Barry Kramis and to Robert Dunham for their splendid organization of what must have been a mind-bogglingly complex organizational task. But I think it's something that's clearly bearing its own fruit, and I hope that all the composers who arrived yesterday, and with many of whom I've had the privilege of conversing, are as excited about this whole week as I am. I've spoken during the course of this week about matters of faith, matters of art, and the coming together of the two in a, if you like, in a general Christian perspective. Tonight I'm going to talk from an Orthodox perspective, because that's part of my identity. But I believe and hope that it will have resonances beyond that and be of interest to you all. So my title is Orthodox Aesthetics and Contemporary Art. Without attempting to arrive at anything resembling a definitive statement, I should like to touch tonight on some aspects of orthodoxy and contemporary art, in particular music. It's a theme that I believe deserves more sustained and profound consideration than it has in general been accorded. Though much recent popular reaction might lead us at times to believe that the depths of spirituality are immediately apprehensible through certain works of art, reactions from within the Orthodox Church itself, and proper consideration of the position of the artist who takes spiritual matters seriously, must inevitably lead us to a realization that the situation is in fact far more complex than this would suggest. The late Orthodox theologian Philip Sherrod wrote the following: "The bitter truth is that both the artists and the works of art that have formed the culture of our local European and American world are, for the most part, among the chief agents of precisely that fragmentation and alienation, the full effects of which are now all too evident. There can be no art that can resist, let alone prevent, the triumphal course of our technological civilization towards whatever nemesis it may be leading us, except that which itself derives from a way of life whose vision and central experience transcend the categories, psychic, materialistic, of which this civilization is the final monstrous projection. And there can be no art that manifests such vision and experience, no art that possesses a sacred quality, until there are artists who have first rediscovered how to live a way of life in which their realization is possible." End of quotation. Even if one adopts a slightly less apocalyptic view of our current times than Sherrod was wont to do, his argument requires serious analysis. He took the view that the modern world is so skewed, so eccentric, in the true sense of that word, that one had to pose the question of whether it was even possible to create a work of sacred art. Could the artist penetrate his surroundings in order to re-establish contact with spiritual realities in such a way that he would become a vehicle for such creation? It's possible, while accepting Sherrod's central thesis that we live in a culture in ruins, to argue that a more optimistic vision is required in order for creation to be possible. If, in other words, one searches for glimpses of the sacred in the secular, if one searches for links with the truth of Christianity in the humanism of the Renaissance, if one is receptive to the idea of Messiaen's music or Rouault's paintings, say, opening a door to the sacred rather than viewing them as monstrous expressions of Western decadence and complexity, one acquires some sort of context in which to situate the search for the expression of the sacred as it is understood in orthodoxy. Indeed, recent musicological and iconographical research has revealed that to view East and West as two opposing forces is precisely a product of our modern, fragmented way of thinking. The Bulgarian musicologist Svetlana Kugundzieva, amongst others, has worked on post-Byzantine chant and the relationship of sacred chant to Bulgarian folk music. She's taken a synthetic approach, examining a number of chant traditions and taking the view that there was an open culture between East and West during the Middle Ages. Something confirmed not only by the work of other scholars of Byzantine chant, such as Jürgen Rasted, but, for example, by recent musicological investigation and performances of Croatian medieval music by Katarina Livljanic, and also recent research by Croatian and Italian scholars into iconography in the Adriatic, a meeting point of West and East. For an Orthodox artist working in a Western milieu, such an approach is not only likely to be more positive and more fruitful, but also better able to transmit the theological richness and truth of the Christian faith to that very milieu. In saying this, however, I wish to make it very clear that I'm not advocating any kind of theological or doctrinal compromise, still less any kind of facile universalism or perennialism. On the contrary, it seems obvious that by proclaiming the Christian faith in the arts, the creators of those same arts have a God-given opportunity to witness to their beliefs. It is important too, at this point, to draw a distinction between liturgical art and what I call paraliturgical art, and what one might characterize as spiritual art. And Robert put his finger on that word just now. The problem of reconciling the still prevalent or even dominant notion of the artist's drive to self-expression with the ideal of the egoless iconographer, a theme very common in much Orthodox discussion of these matters, has, I would argue, been posited in too simplistic a fashion in discussion of this theme. In the late 1980s, the late Sir John Taverner, my former teacher, spoke about this a good deal in a number of lectures and writings. In an interview he gave to Paul Griffiths in 1985, he said, quote, "If one sees music as a spiritual journey, as I do, then it must always go forward, and I think it must eventually end in silence. I never understood that with Stockhausen, why it didn't end in silence. Perhaps it will. I think it must end in silence and go on to prayer, which is a higher form of creativity." End of quotation. Now, the problem with viewing the question in these terms is that it confuses what is essentially a monastic vision of creativity with the position of an artist living in the world. And whether prayer is a form of creativity, in precisely the way Taverner means here, must be seriously questioned, bringing into play as it does the use of the imagination in prayer. As St. Maximus the Confessor wrote, "The virtues separate the intellect from the passions. Spiritual contemplation separates it from its passion-free conceptual images of things. Pure prayer brings it into the presence of God himself." By these observations, I do not mean that it is not possible for an artist to live monastically in the world, because it is obviously as possible for an artist as it is for any other person, but that there is a confusion of aims. If a composer wishes to write liturgical music within a particular tradition, then he needs to subject himself to that tradition. And this is precisely what Taverner never did, though he spoke constantly about tradition with a capital T at this period and used elements of tradition in his work. I do not believe that an artist of his creative strength, brought up as he was in the traditions of Western classical music, however much he railed against that tradition at certain periods of his life, could possibly dissociate himself from his ego sufficiently to do this, and neither do I believe that it would be desirable. Magnificent achievement, though a work such as his Vigil Service, written for an Anglican choir and celebrated by Orthodox clergy at its first performance, magnificent though that is, and much though it does indeed draw from Greek and Russian traditions, it is also utterly impregnated with Taverner's personality, from the melodic style to the lush harmonies and the use of handbells. Naturally, all this is problematic only if one believes that one is working within a particular tradition. In accepting that it is a mixture of traditions and liturgically eccentric, in part for that reason, as Taverner himself subsequently did, the problem ceases to exist. If one changes the perspective and views such a work as a proclamation of Orthodox Christian belief designed for particular circumstances in a non-Orthodox country, it becomes instead a fascinating monument to the richness of several musical traditions and the unique liturgical achievement. By extension, it's possible for works that are apparently completely secular and which do not even employ voices to be shot through with Orthodox Christian metaphysics. My work, Epitaphios, from 1988, for solo cello and string orchestra, for example, is a literal depiction of the crucifixion, the harrowing of hell, and the resurrection. When it was premiered in Athens, a large proportion of the audience intuitively understood it in that sense because of the manifold references to Byzantine chants from Holy Week. When it was performed on another occasion in Canada, there was no such connection, but he met with a similarly warm response. And my piano quintet, Nocturne of Light, which will be performed this evening, commissioned by Paul Barnes, deals with the same theme and also contains direct reference to Byzantine chant at his request. And you will actually hear those chants, which he will sing for you before the performance. A number of Arvo Pärt's works, such as Silouan's Song for String Orchestra, could also be cited in this context. In such a situation, any message that is contained in the music will inevitably reach some and not others. And this is as it should be, because the musical message is actually far greater than the framework imposed by the composer's inspiration. If one takes this path, that of accepting that one is created in a desacralized world, that not only is one far from an Edenic state, but that one cannot even create work of sacred inspiration and claim that one speaks for the whole of Christianity, then paradoxically, the overwhelming negativity of such a situation becomes the basis for a positive response. Despair, as the sin against the Holy Spirit, is impossible. One can only look up. Some composers from the Orthodox world, such as the Serbian Rajko Maksimovic and the Greek Michael Adamis, have always known this. Maksimovic, highly respected both inside and outside his native Serbia, has never limited his musical vocabulary and expressive potential. His music, which draws deeply from sources of Serbian Orthodox inspiration, demands to be taken seriously as contemporary art music, not as a specialist product on the extremist fringes. The same is true of the work of Adamis, who perhaps embraced this putative dichotomy with even more fervor, in that he was active not only as a musicologist working on Byzantine chant, but studied electronic music in the United States, at Brandeis. The ne plus ultra of this is perhaps his work Kratima from 1971, which takes a recording of a Greek psaltis, a Greek chanter, and subjects it to electronic manipulation. And while his later music entered more deeply into the melos, the melodic structure of Byzantine chant, without such an externally visible conflict, it is undeniable that the heritage of modernism was made use of by Adamis in an entirely natural and musically and spiritually productive way. Some comments made by Arvo Pärt in an interview given to Enzo Restagna a few years ago are also of considerable relevance here. Arvo Pärt said, and I quote, "As you see, once again we come up against the concept of spirit. By the term spiritual, I do not understand anything mystical, but very concrete things. There are various ways of thinking. Some have a constantly negative vision, others see everything in a positive light. Early music and art in general teach us to look at things in this perspective. For example, Fra Angelico painted pictures in which he portrays the Last Judgment. Naturally, hell is represented, but even this is as though it were in some way veiled with holiness. There's only a little more color. For other painters who came afterwards, hell was a more real place, but their heaven was not as pure as that of Fra Angelico." End of quotation. It's clear that in Pärt's music, with the possible exception of his Miserere, that heaven for him is as present as it is for Fra Angelico or Mozart, and its luminosity touches everything he does. And while one may certainly detect resonance of the Russian choral tradition in more recent works such as the Canon Pokayanin, it is significant that Pärt's musical sources at the time, when he was attempting to renew his style, were not Eastern but Western: Gregorian chant, Machaut, Ockeghem, Palestrina. Titus Burckhardt, the Swiss scholar of comparative religions, touched on this matter in his extraordinary treatise Principes et méthodes d'art sacré, first published in 1958, in which he wrote, "The Christian world has always known, side by side with an art that is sacred in the strict sense of the word, a religious art using more or less worldly forms." And though Burckhardt was concerned particularly with the plastic arts, this statement seems to be particularly relevant to the present discussion. A great many works by Adamis, Taverner, Pärt, and myself fit particularly well in this category. As examples, one could cite Adamis's Tetelestai, Taverner's The Protecting Veil, which I'm sure many of you know, and Arvo Pärt's Dopo la Vittoria, or my piano concerto, which I mentioned the other day, L'inno Laulo, Birdsong. The late Lima de Freitas, a Portuguese painter, once said that art is not art if it's not sacred. While his definition of sacred was in any case rather different from mine, I would subscribe to a modified version of this proposition, while emphasizing that sacredness may well not be evident to all who come in contact with the art. Art is not art if it has no love. If, with St. Paul, we believe that God is love, the consequences that follow from such a statement are self-evident. With that in mind, then, I would like to close with some considerations on the idea of paraliturgical composition. It might be thought that, as both composer and priest, my entire musical attention will be focused on the liturgy. In a sense, it is. But this does not mean an exclusive dedication to functional liturgical music. I've always resisted what I think of as the Kapellmeister syndrome, whereby a composer defines himself exclusively as a church composer, and very frequently writes music of substandard quality. It's my firmly held belief that composers need to learn to be composers with no qualification of that role, and acquire all the skills that will make them able to respond to requests for music of many different kinds, even if they may subsequently spend most or all of their time actually writing for liturgical contexts. What can be said then of the question of writing new paraliturgical music? Extant repertoires of such music, diverse though they are, certainly do not exhaust the possibilities of the genre, if such it can be called. And indeed, one could conceivably argue that the genre is infinitely expandable. There is also the missionary argument, the idea that what is often called here in America soft evangelism may take place where the liturgy is, as it were, taken to the marketplace, the concert hall, somewhat like St. Paul preaching in the Agora in Athens, perhaps. And it's an idea that may have its attractions, though personally I have never sought to proselytize in this way. Nevertheless, as the existence of traditional repertoires of paraliturgical music indicates, there is a space somewhere between the church and the community in which a need for something that brings the sacred into the world is fulfilled. Wedding songs, carols for various liturgical seasons, and so on. In modern Western society, I would argue that that space has been expanded in such a way as to include the concert hall. While thinking about this subject, I came across a definition of the word paraliturgical, which seems to me quite remarkable. It's to be found at catholicculture.org, which is a website in turn taken from the Modern Catholic Dictionary by Father John Harden. And it reads as follows: paraliturgical, form of public worship in which Catholics engage without following the official liturgy or take unauthorized liberties in removing or changing the words or actions required by church law. Now, the first part of this definition is in accordance with what the Roman Catholic Church calls a paraliturgy, the gathering of the faithful in the absence of a priest or deacon, possibly with the distribution of Holy Communion. In the Orthodox Church, this would be called typika, a reader's service, but the distribution of Holy Communion could only take place with clergy present. The second part is more intriguing, without following the official liturgy, which means that there is room for improvisation in the paraliturgy. And the third part, positively alarming, take unauthorized liberties in removing or changing the words or actions required by church law. This is an extremely negative view of paraliturgy, but it's clearly born of experience. While I'm glad to say that I have had no such experience myself, the second part's mention of an unofficial liturgy of course suggests such things as the medieval pilgrim songs from the Libro Vermelho, or the collections of Laude Spirituale used by the Brotherhoods in Italy throughout the Middle Ages and long after, or the Russian Duchovny Stiki, spiritual songs. There are many, many examples. And these seem to me fruitful models and much closer to what I have in mind when I use the term paraliturgical. In the absence of an actual lay service or of a brotherhood requiring processional hymns, however, it seems to me that the main motivation for the composition of a new paraliturgical work today must be the discovery of a text. And one point of departure is the existence of spiritual or dogmatic texts that lie outside the ritual framework for various reasons. These could naturally include texts that have already been set to music, such as carols or the Laude Spirituale already mentioned. And there is the famous example in the Orthodox world of the paraliturgical hymn Agni Parthene, whose text was written by St. Nectarius of Egina. But there are other kinds of spiritual poetry of much greater dimensions. The Kontakia of the 6th century St. Romanos the Melodist provide a good example, in that the Kontakion, in its original very lengthy liturgical form as a poetical sermon, no longer has a place in the Byzantine liturgy. We therefore have a corpus of extended texts of great theological depth and poetic skill, which also possess a very clear structure, that were written for liturgical use but now have no function. And they would seem an obvious source for composers seeking for spiritual texts, but in fact have attracted little attention. the only examples of which I know are by a Lutheran composer, Paul Nicholson, which is a setting of the Kontakion on the victory of the cross, and a setting by the late Richard Toonsing, who was Orthodox, of the Kontakion on the Nativity of Christ. There's also the Akathistos hymn, which is still in liturgical use, but it's the only one. Other suitable texts, though they have never had a liturgical function precisely, are theological poems, such as the Hymn to the Holy Spirit by St. Simeon the New Theologian, a 10th century saint, which begins with a series of invocations that easily suggest musical treatment. Come, true light, come, life eternal, come, hidden mystery, come, treasure without name, come, reality beyond all words. And this text was indeed set by the late Sir John Taverner as the central movement of his Icon of Light, written for the Tallis Scholars in 1984. Taverner's setting of this invocation allows him to give full rein to his melodic gifts, and the gradual increase in intensity and the sense of movement within stasis create an extraordinary and intense luminosity, fully expressive of St. Simeon's vision of light. The shorter movements on either side of this are related to each other symmetrically, so 1 to 6, 2 to 7, and 3 to 5, and they amplify and comment on the central idea of light. He simply sets in Greek the words phos, light, doxa, glory, and epiphania, shining forth, plus the trisagion, Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy on us. I adopted a similar approach in a recent work entitled Simeon. Simeon means today in Byzantine liturgical Greek. The work was commissioned by the Huivarts trio from Belgium as a counterbalance to Arvo Pärt's vision of the crucifixion in his Stabat Mater, a work I admire enormously, and which prompted me to choose the theme of the resurrection to balance the theme. It also dictated the scoring, vocal trio and string trio. A number of hymns from Holy Week in the Byzantine Rite begin with the word today, underlining the reality and presence of the events of the Passion in the lives of the faithful, which is why I chose this word as the work's title. The texts I used are from the services for Holy Week and Pascha, but the center of the piece is part of a remarkable 2nd century poetic homily, Peri Pascha, on Pascha, by Bishop Melito of Sardis. It's an extraordinary summary of early Christian theology, placing the narrative of the Passion and Resurrection within the context of salvation history as a whole. It's been described as a precursor of the Kontakion and closely follows the liturgical sequence of Holy Friday, and its impact is quite as immediate as St. Simeon's prayer to the Holy Spirit. I'd like to read it to you. It's short. I think you'll gain an idea from this of its extraordinary power. And the law became word, and the old new, coming out of Zion and Jerusalem, and the command grace, and the image reality, and the lamb a son, and the sheep a man, because born as a son, and led as a lamb, and slain as a sheep, and buried as a man, rose from dead as God, being by nature God and man. He is everything. The law because he judges, the word because he teaches, the grace because he saves, the Father because he begets, the Son because he is begotten, the sheep because he suffers, a man because he is buried, God because he rises. This is Jesus Christ, whose glory is unto the ages of ages. Amen. An amazing poem, I think you'll agree. So in my work, the word today is repeatedly used, both as a structural pillar, as a reiteration of the presence and reality of the events of the Passion and Resurrection of Christ. And while the narrative is given to the three voices, the string trio is also an active participant in its musical presentation, as well as, particularly towards the end of the work, a metaphysical commentator haloing the words sung as though in an icon. Such paraliturgical music is then, for me, a way forward, the creation of something that is not liturgical, but which may involve liturgical elements, and as a deep expression of the Church's theology, but destined for performance outside the Church. One could describe this, in fact, as an eschatological procedure. If the divine liturgy, the Eucharist, is the presence of the kingdom of God, then as artists we are certainly called upon to transmit the message of that kingdom outside the four walls of the church building. Thank you.
We have about 20 minutes where we are going to be able to ask questions of Father Moody. I'd ask that as far as protocol here, let's go ahead and stand. We don't have an open mic or a roving mic, so let's go ahead and stand and with a loud voice go ahead and ask your question, and then of course you can sit after that.
Perhaps there aren't any questions. Perhaps I've said the last word on the subject. Please.
Everyone appears to be quoted using holy minimalism.
Yes.
I'm kind of curious what your takes are on the thought of holy music in general. We have the spiritual music.
Yes.
What do you think about holy minimalism?
Well, actually, I loathe the term holy minimalism. It started out as a pejorative term, but it stuck, in particular for Taverner and Perth and Gorecki. And it's a very unfair term, partly because their music is completely different. You cannot confuse the music of Taverner with the music of Perth and with the music of Gorecki. They're completely different technically and in sound. Nevertheless, I can see why it arose. It's a convenient label to I mean, all it means is composers who use a certain element of certain amount of repetition in their work and who set sacred texts. That's the simplest definition of it. I prefer the term sacred, really. There is a problem with terminology here, because if you write, even if you write liturgical music, it could not be holy, but it should be sacred. This is a slightly difficult area to clarify. And for a similar reason, I dislike the word spiritual. As I said yesterday in the table talk, spiritual music can refer to the kind of thing you listen to while your feet are being massaged. It's and that's usually all it's good for. It's the thing is that you can't make music holy. You can't say, I've written a holy piece. You can't do it. You can set a text from a sacred tradition and intend that music to be part of that tradition in some way, or stand at an angle from it, but you can't yourself make it holy. It becomes part of the church's tradition or the church's use, and then it's perhaps consecrated by use. That's about as near as we can get to it. Does that answer your question?
Okay. Do you see the use of liturgical music in the Orthodox tradition as a means of somehow uniting the global church, including Protestants and Catholics alike, through means of music, because of the things that we have that are similar, since we focus so often on the things that we believe that are different? Do you see this as a grand, in the grand scheme of things, as something that God has called us to do, to make peace with our brothers that we so often are incited to dislike or marginalize?
That's a very interesting question. I, of course, have no intimate knowledge of God's grand scheme. However, it struck me on Wednesday morning that the positive reactions to the chapel service, which, as Barry said, was a first here at Biola. It was a liturgical service based on a Byzantine office, effectively. It struck me that had a powerful impact on people. I certainly believe that Orthodox liturgical music can be, I wouldn't say a missionary tool, but as you said, a means of promoting unity, because the other thing that struck me being here is how many icons there are around the place, which I wasn't expecting to see. And I've been into the president's office and the provost's office, and there are icons, and several other people have icons. There is also this phenomenon, I mean, the Roman Catholics are very interested in icons these days, so are the Anglicans. But actually, I wouldn't just limit that to Orthodox liturgical music. I think that the Roman Catholic tradition has a similar possibility. The wonderful, rich tradition of Gregorian chant and polyphony, and I know there are Roman Catholic composers here, and I'm sure they would agree with me about that. I think if you have a living musical tradition in a church, it's something that Christians who do not have such a tradition may find of spiritual value. That's about as much as I can say. And that accords with my experience of what people have said after attending such events, such services, such gatherings for the first time. Ruth.
I've heard that okay. Hi, I'm Ruth. When Christ became incarnate, our understanding of the incarnation is reflected in our art. Mm-hmm. And I know I've heard that talked about in regards to icons, but I wonder if you could tell us about how the incarnation affects our music.
Yes. I mentioned the incarnation yesterday. I mentioned that I love the incarnate quality of the sound of Byzantine chanting and Russian chanting. The incarnation was a real event. If we are Christians, we have to believe in the incarnation. We can't get round it. There's no point in getting round it. We wouldn't be Christians if we didn't believe in it. And that means that Christ lived on earth as a man, and so he can be depicted. That's the point of icons. Icons are possible because Christ was a person, a human person who could be painted. We can't paint God, but we can paint Christ. Similarly, music can express that incarnate quality. And that connects with what I was saying about spiritual music. Spiritual music is the opposite. It's ethereal, it's fluffy, it's cotton wool, candy floss. And genuinely sacred music, whether it's liturgical or paraliturgical, but when it's really connected to that sense of the sacred, I think it sounds incarnate. It sounds incarnate because we believe in the incarnation. We believe in the reality of God on earth as man. That would be my answer to that. Okay, over there first. We'll come back to you.
Recently, Pope Francis gave a message to a famous American Protestant evangelist, and he spoke about Joseph and his brothers. And the analogy he used was that Joseph's brothers didn't have bread, but they had coins. And they had to go to their brother to change the coins to get bread. And then he went on to say, we have our traditions. Those are our coins. We need to train them in. Where does tradition get in the way of our relationship with God?
Tradition gets in the way of our relationship with God when we make it an idol. Simple as that. If tradition is not something that's a means for channeling God, for communicating with God, it's dead. It's a museum piece, and it's not alive. So, and that can happen, and does happen. And that's a danger that any church with a long liturgical tradition needs to face and realize that it's there. So thank you for that question.
I'm intrigued by your familiarity with Tavener and some of the comments that you're making, which, with my much smaller familiarity with Tavener, seem curious. For example, when you just talked about the need to really get grounded as a means of being the opposite of spiritual, what I understood about what Tavener was trying to do in his refutation of counterpoint, for example, or so many other things, is trying to reach some sort of in my understanding, maybe the words are wrong, but maybe you could help me with the right terminology. He's trying to reach some sort of a spiritual plane. And I'm sorry if it's the wrong words, but I think he actually used words very much like that. Could you talk about the difference between what you're talking about being grounded as being some sort of a ways of expressing some of these things, and the way that Tavener was at the same time just refuting exactly the same sort of, it sounds to me the same sort of thing you're talking about.
Indeed. He always said to me that chanting and singing and music must be incarnate. He always had that idea as well. And I think it is there. I don't think his music is fluffy. It's not angels sitting on a cloud playing harps. It's, even in a work of such transcendent beauty as the protecting veil, it starts from the ground. It rises out of the ground. It's human aspiration. And he accepts the reality of things like the Annunciation. You can feel the reality when he writes music about these events. He's not writing a postcard, a Christmas card. He's writing something. He's writing about the reality of an angel with huge beating wings, telling Mary that she's going to have a baby by the Holy Spirit, and you can feel that in the music. Nevertheless, it takes you to another place. It takes you beyond the earthly, certainly. I don't know if that answers your question.
I don't even like it. Well, here it is. But his the way he talked about things and the way that he had such disdain for Western music and Bach and everything else.
Okay.
Because it didn't have anything to do with this other world that he was talking about. And
Okay.
it was he used some pretty heavy terms.
Yes, he did. And he later went back on that. I don't know if you saw the things he said towards the end of his life. He revisited many areas of Western music and said, well, actually, I was wrong about this and I was very harsh. But, he was a man of extremes, and he needed to do that at that period of his life. And he was searching for something that he thought he couldn't find in Western music. For example, he said about Messiaen, that Messiaen took hold of the complexity of Western music and thought that he had to get on with it and deal with it. And Tavener instead said, well, I throw it out, I won't have it in my music. Though he came back to it. So there is that aspect. And also, he had in his head a kind of archetypal East, a kind of archetypal early Christianity, which was full of this monastic, desert-like simplicity, and he wanted to get to that, and he couldn't find that in Western music. He once told me that he thought the greatest Western composer was Hildegard of Bingen, which is a pretty remarkable thing for anyone to say. But this was standard fare in our composition lessons. And towards the end of his life, he wouldn't have said that. He changed his mind, so he was able to change his mind. But he was quite capable of saying things just for an effect as well. He wasn't. Please.
Thank you so much for this tonight. I have a cultural question, and I appreciate what the way you talk about spirituality versus something which is deeper. Much of the world's appreciation for and adulation for Arvo Pärt and his music, however, is on the spirituality level. People listen to it as they're having their feet massaged.
Indeed.
And I think, so I'm wondering in your experience in Europe, which is so far ahead of North America in terms of its being post-Christian, and I come from Canada. Canada is much more post-Christian than down here in the States. But how are you experiencing the audience reception to work which is not presented as spiritual, but presented as faith-filled and sacred? Are you finding audiences are moving beyond the quick, easy spiritual fix with a candle and a massage?
Well, such music is usually presented in concert, probably in churches with candles around, that rather encourage that kind of atmosphere, or else they are plugged into some other kind of program. For example, when a group such as the Tallis Scholars or the 16, who are essentially early music groups, when they program composers like Taverner or Pat, the Tallis Scholars have just made an entire CD of Pat, by the way, not available yet. It fits into a program of presenting basically Renaissance music in a concert context. So you don't have that foot massage aspect. And I think that's healthier. I think it's more honest. Because there's a deception involved here, isn't there? If you present this music as a spiritual warm bath, you're not doing the music a service either. It's a fraud. There's a deception involved. And of course, people are very uncomfortable with expressions of faith. I've got to the point at which I really don't care. I go to concerts of contemporary music wearing my cassock and cross, and people say, "Oh, look, there he is. He's just come from Vespers." Well, they know I'm there because I want to hear the contemporary music, because that's what I do. These are two parallel activities in my life. But you have to get to that point at which you don't care, and then people treat you properly, and they take you seriously. If you skirt around the issue and soften it and make it into candy floss, then the problems begin, because you're not being honest. I would much rather have a conversation with an open-hearted atheist, so that we know what our positions are, than have be dancing around each other. I don't see the point in that at all. Question over there. Oh, yeah.
Just as quick, I just have a question about a quote that you quoted Taverner on, and I just understand what he means by silence. You said, if one sees music as a spiritual journey, as I do, then I think it must always go forward, which I love that part, and I think it must eventually end in silence. I never understood that with Stockhausen. Why didn't it end with silence? What did he mean by that?
Oh, he always had this thing about Stockhausen. He even looked a bit like Stockhausen. He cultivated the long hair. But I think the work he really meant was Stimmung. That work impressed him more than any other piece of Stockhausen's. And he thought that Stockhausen had a spiritual line somehow, and that he never fulfilled it. He couldn't understand why he was writing these, the opera series. But then it's very interesting. Taverner wrote a piece when he was very ill, in 2010, called Towards Silence. And it's a piece based on the speed of his own heartbeat, which was very, very slow. And it's a kind of confrontation of his own mortality. But then he carried on. He was still alive for another few years, and he carried on writing at a furious rate. Well, as furious as he could. He was very physically impaired. But he carried on writing. So silence actually didn't become an option for him either. There was a question over there. Yeah.
I'd like to make an observation, which I'm not asking you to respond to if you don't want to. I grew up with the definition of prayer as whatever raises the mind and the heart to God. Now, this could be the text or the music or both. And I'd like to give you two examples, two of which did, one of which did not. I can give you many examples of others which have. The first example is when I inadvertently turned on the radio and I heard the beginning of the Palestrina motet. My heart and the mind went up there. Several years ago, it was during a live performance of the Stravinsky Mass, which I had heard many times, sometimes on the recording, and a couple of times, I think even conducted by Stravinsky himself. My mind and the heart went up there. Now, a long time ago, my wife and I were in Paris, and this is the first time I heard something by Arvo Pärt. My mind went down. I thought the music was so trite, it could not possibly raise my heart and mind to up there.
Well, thank you. This is also something that we skirt around when we talk about tradition, the question of taste. The question of taste in broad cultural terms is extremely important, and some things just don't do the same thing to everybody. They don't produce the same reaction. So I respect your reaction. I can't say any more.
You said the music sounds incarnational. What did you mean by that?
I mean that it sounds as though it comes from the human soul yearning to be with God, and coming from the recognition, as I said before, that Christ was man and God, and that it's not just a vision of a blue sky with angels floating around in it. It has its basis in human reality. Does that make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Thank you so much for your talk tonight. Thanks, Joel. Yeah, thank you. When you talk about tradition, my question is, when you talk about we can participate directly in the line of tradition within its parameters, or we can write in a paraliturgical context. And my question is, can a tradition itself be lost in a kind of watering down effect if we have a whole generation or several generations of artists, composers, etc., drawing as they will from different places? The purity of each line gets lost.
Yes, I would say that was a danger. And actually, this is one area in which I had a very profound disagreement with Taverner later in his life when he became a perennialist. He started to draw on many different religious traditions. And I discussed this with him, and I said, I can't follow this. I don't know what you're doing. And it's something I could never do myself. I mean, that's a very broad example, but in my own music, I use different traditions. I've drawn on Russian traditions, on Greek traditions, on Serbian traditions. But for me, they're unified because they're all different ethnic expressions, if you like, of Orthodox musical culture. So I don't see a dilution there. But I see what you mean. I think you have to find your place. You have to find your standpoint, and work out your perspective from that standpoint. Rather than moving around, you have to say, well, I'm here. In my case, that's the perspective of being somebody who was born in England, and which doesn't have an Orthodox culture, and that makes me feel very free to move into those areas of the world that do have an Orthodox culture and to work with them, and make something new with them. But of course, again, that's in the paraliturgical field. Well, not entirely, because I do write liturgical music, obviously. But if you're talking about a body of music specifically for liturgy, then I would say that you'd have to be very careful. You can end up with a liturgical smorgasbord, a kind of a sweet trolley, and say, well, I'll have that, and that, and that, and you have no sense of liturgical integrity. And if you have a liturgical tradition, some of us do, some of us don't. If you have a liturgical tradition, it's got to be well done from that point of view. It's got to be integrated, and it's got to have its own natural dynamic curve and its own stylistic coherence.
I think we have time for one more question, perhaps, if there is one.
From your perspective of someone who has written sacred music, can you say something about how important you think it is to draw from, or to write music to texts that have already been written, as opposed to always trying to create a new text out of maybe your own inspiration of what the word should be?
If it's liturgical music we're talking about, in the Byzantine Rite, in the Orthodox Church, we have a fixed order of things. We can't just invent our own texts. The only time that texts are improvised or created anew are really in sermons. If you're talking about music, sacred music or paraliturgical music outside the church's services, well, my answer would be that if one were a poet as well as a composer, then that would be possible. I've compiled texts for my own pieces. I haven't written poetry because I'm not a poet. As I was saying, with regard to paraliturgical music, there is such a number of texts that have fallen into disuse, such as the Kontakia and early liturgical poems that, or not even liturgical, but early poems that fully express the theology of the early church, but have no liturgical setting, no liturgical function anymore. So that's almost like being given a brand new text written for you by a poet to set.
Well, Father Moody, thank you so much for your time tonight. We have been fed in more ways than one, and let's give Reverend Moody a hand.
We hope you enjoyed this message. Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Learn more at biola.edu.